The blood-soaked dirt beneath Beatrice Wheeler's knees had turned to mud as she sobbed over her husband's lifeless body, the echoes of gunshots still ringing in the air of Juniper Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. The local sheriff stood by helplessly, his hat clutched in his hands, while her 3 young children huddled together several feet away, their faces streaked with tears and fear. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wheeler," the sheriff muttered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind that swept down from the mountains. "But your husband owed money to some powerful people. This wasn't just about a gambling debt. He was skimming from Mr. Holloway's mining operation." Beatrice's hands trembled as she closed James's vacant eyes. "He wouldn't steal," she whispered, though the doubt had already crept into her heart. James had been gambling more, staying out later, becoming increasingly secretive. But theft? Murder? How had their lives unraveled so completely? "Madam," the sheriff continued, shifting uncomfortably, "I need to tell you something else. With James gone, Mr. Holloway is claiming your property as compensation. You have until the end of the week to vacate the premises." She looked up, rain and tears blurring her vision. "That's impossible. Where would we go? I have 3 children." The sheriff's eyes darted away. "I don't rightly know, madam. But Holloway's got the law on his side with those papers your husband signed." That night, after putting her children to bed in the small cabin that had been their home for 5 years, Beatrice sat alone at the kitchen table. Emma was 8, Thomas 6, and little Sarah barely 4. They were too young to understand that their father wasn't coming back, too innocent to comprehend that by week's end, they would be homeless. Dawn broke with cruel indifference to Beatrice's sleepless night. She'd spent hours sorting through their meager possessions, deciding what few items they could carry. The children moved silently through their morning routine, the weight of their father's absence hanging heavy in the air. "Where are we going, Mama?" Emma asked, her small voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "To town first," Beatrice answered, forcing confidence into her voice. "We'll find a place to stay until I can secure work." The journey into Juniper Creek took over an hour on foot. Beatrice carried Sarah while Thomas and Emma trudged alongside, each clutching a small bundle of belongings. The town emerged through the morning mist, a collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single dirt road, with the church steeple rising above the rest. Their first stop was the boarding house run by Mrs. Finley, an elderly widow known for her charitable nature. Beatrice knocked on the door, her heart pounding with desperate hope. "Mrs. Finley's face fell when she saw them. "Oh, Beatrice, I heard about James. I'm so sorry. We need a room, just until I can find work and a more permanent situation." The older woman's eyes darted to the children, then back to Beatrice. "I wish I could help, truly I do. But Mr. Holloway made it clear that anyone assisting the Wheeler family would face consequences. He's determined to make an example of your husband's betrayal." "But the children, I'm sorry," Mrs. Finley whispered, closing the door. Similar rejections awaited them at every turn. The general store owner couldn't offer Beatrice work. The schoolteacher couldn't provide temporary shelter. Even the church minister claimed his hands were tied, offering prayers instead of practical assistance. By mid-afternoon, they sat on a bench outside the general store, the children hungry and tired. Beatrice fought back tears as she divided their last bit of bread, wondering if she should take them into the hills and try to reach the next town, some 30 miles away. "You Wheeler folks?" a gruff voice asked. Beatrice looked up to see a tall man standing before them. His clothes were dusty from the trail, his face weathered from years under the sun. A cowboy, by the look of him, with piercing blue eyes that assessed them with unnerving intensity. "Yes," she answered cautiously. "Name's Xavier Blackwood. Heard you might be in need of assistance." He shifted awkwardly, as if enthused to offering help. "Mr. Holloway's man?" Beatrice asked, instinctively pulling Sarah closer. Xavier's expression hardened. "I don't work for that snake. Got my own place north of here. Small cattle operation. Why would you help us? Everyone else in town is too afraid." "Not everyone follows Holloway's orders," he said simply. "And I've got room at my ranch. Been looking for help anyway." Beatrice studied him, searching for deceit in his features. "What kind of help? Someone to cook, keep house. I can pay fair wages." His eyes moved to the children. "Place is big enough for all of you." Emma tugged at Beatrice's sleeve. "Mama, I'm scared," she whispered. Xavier knelt down, bringing himself to the child's level. Name's Xavier, little miss. What's yours? Emma, she replied shyly. Well, Emma, I've got horses back at my ranch. Do you like horses? Emma nodded cautiously. And I've got chickens that need feeding every morning. Think you could help with that? A tiny smile appeared on Emma's face. I could do that. Xavier stood, turning his attention back to Beatrice. Look, Mrs. Wheeler, I understand your caution. But night's coming, and you need somewhere safe. My offer's genuine. Beatrice weighed their options, which were painfully few. This stranger was offering shelter when everyone else had turned them away. Yet the risk of trusting too quickly. How do I know we'll be safe with you? Xavier removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with early gray. Fair question. Sheriff Mason knows me. Been supplying beef to this town for 5 years without incident. Ask him about me if you'd like. The sheriff hasn't been particularly helpful today. Then trust your instincts, madam. But offer stands regardless. Thomas stepped forward suddenly. Do you have a gun to keep the bad men away? He asked, his small voice trembling. Xavier's expression softened. I do, son. And nobody comes onto my land causing trouble. Beatrice stood, decision made. We accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood. But I want to be clear we'll work for our keep. I won't accept charity. Wouldn't dream of offering it. He replied with the hint of a smile. My wagon's behind the livery. We should leave before Holloway's men return from the mines. The journey to Xavier's ranch took nearly 2 hours, the wagon creaking along a winding trail that led away from town and deeper into the rolling grasslands. The children had fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's ordeal, their small bodies huddled together on the wagon bed. How far are we from town? Beatrice asked, breaking the long silence. About 12 miles, Xavier replied, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. Far enough that Holloway doesn't bother me. Close enough to sell my cattle. And you live alone? Got a ranch hand, Miguel? Good man from down Mexico way. Keeps to himself mostly. Xavier glanced at her. Place isn't fancy, but it's solid. Built it myself. As they crested a hill, the ranch came into view, a modest homestead nestled in a small valley, with a main house, barn, corral, and several outbuildings. A creek cut through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. It wasn't grand, but it looked well-maintained and peaceful. It's lovely, Beatrice said softly, surprised by the genuine admiration she felt. Xavier seemed pleased but embarrassed by her comment. It serves its purpose. They pulled up to the house just as the sun was setting. Xavier helped them down from the wagon, then carried the still sleeping Sarah onto the porch. I'll show you where you'll stay, he said, leading them inside. The interior was simple but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and doors leading to what appeared to be bedrooms. The furniture was functional rather than decorative, and few personal touches adorned the space. You and the girls can take this room, Xavier said, opening a door to reveal a bedroom with a large bed and a smaller one in the corner. Thomas can bunk with me for now, or we can set up something in here if you prefer. This is very generous, Beatrice said, carefully laying Sarah on the larger bed. Emma climbed up beside her sister, eyes wide as she took in their new surroundings. There's a washroom out back, Xavier continued. I'll get some water heated for you. Must be wanting to clean up after the day you've had. Thank you, Beatrice replied, the simple kindness nearly breaking her composure. I'll help with dinner once the children are settled. Xavier shook his head. Got stew already made. You rest tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough to start working. After he left to tend to the horses, Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, the reality of their situation hitting her anew. James was gone. Their home was lost. They were now dependent on the goodwill of a stranger. Yet for the first time since the sheriff had delivered the devastating news, she felt a glimmer of hope. Mama, Emma whispered, is this our home now? Beatrice stroked her daughter's hair. For now, sweetheart. Mr. Blackwood is being very kind to give us shelter. He seems nice, Emma said thoughtfully. Not scary like those men in town. Yes, Beatrice agreed, surprised by how quickly her daughter had assessed Xavier. But remember, we're here to work. This isn't charity. Emma nodded solemnly. I'll help with the chickens, like he said. And I'll do whatever is needed to keep you all safe, Beatrice promised, though she wasn't entirely sure how she would fulfill that vow. The next morning, Beatrice woke before dawn, old habits from ranch life ingrained deeply. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake the girls, and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Xavier was already there, coffee brewing on the stove. "You're up early," he noted, pouring her a cup without asking. "Farm habits," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Where's Thomas?" "Still sleeping." Boy was exhausted. Xavier leaned against the counter. "Usually have breakfast after the morning chores. Hope that suits." "Of course. I'd like to help with those chores, learn your routine." Xavier nodded. "Miguel will be here soon. He handles the cattle mostly. I'll introduce you." They worked in comfortable silence, Beatrice following Xavier's lead as they fed the horses and collected eggs from the chicken coop. She was impressed by the efficiency of his operation. Everything had its place, every task its purpose. Miguel arrived as they were finishing, a middle-aged Mexican man with a friendly smile and weathered hands. He tipped his hat to Beatrice, greeted Xavier with familiar ease, and listened attentively as their situation was explained. "Mi casa es su casa," Miguel said to Beatrice when Xavier finished. "The boss is a good man. You and your children are safe here." His simple acceptance brought unexpected tears to Beatrice's eyes. "Thank you," she managed, wiping them away quickly. By mid-morning, a routine had begun to establish itself. Beatrice prepared breakfast while Xavier showed the children around the property. Emma, true to her word, had eagerly helped with the chickens. Thomas followed Xavier everywhere, peppering him with questions about the cattle. Even little Sarah had brightened, fascinated by the barn cats that prowled the property. As days turned into weeks, they settled into life at the Blackwood Ranch. Beatrice took over the cooking and household duties, grateful for the chance to contribute. The children thrived in the open space, gradually shedding the fear that had shadowed them since their father's death. Xavier proved to be a fair employer and a surprisingly patient presence with the children. Though reserved by nature, he answered Thomas's endless questions about ranching, taught Emma to ride the gentlest mare, and even fashioned a small swing for Sarah from rope and a wooden plank. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Beatrice found Xavier sitting on the porch, a glass of whiskey in hand as he stared at the stars. "May I join you?" she asked hesitantly. He nodded, setting his glass aside. "Nice night." Beatrice sat in the chair beside him, drawing her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "I wanted to thank you properly. For taking us in, for being so kind to my children." "No need for thanks. You've more than earned your keep. Still, you didn't have to offer us shelter that day. Everyone else turned us away." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "Know what it's like to be turned away," he finally said, his voice low. "Lost my wife and son to fever 5 years ago. Town folks were superstitious, thought the sickness might spread. Nobody would help bury them." Beatrice's heart ached at the pain evident in his voice. "I'm so sorry. Been alone since then. Built this place, focused on the work." He glanced at her. "Your children bring life back to it." "They're healing here," Beatrice admitted. "Thomas barely mentioned his father today. That's the first time since." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Time helps," Xavier said simply. "Not enough, but some." They sat in companionable silence after that, the shared understanding of loss creating a bridge between them. When Beatrice finally rose to go inside, Xavier spoke again. "You belong here," he said quietly. "All of you." The words followed Beatrice into her dreams that night, stirring feelings she'd thought buried with James. Guilt came swiftly on their heels. It had been barely a month since her husband's death. Yet the connection forming between her and Xavier felt different from what she'd shared with James. It was built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than the passionate but volatile relationship of her marriage. The following days brought a new awareness between them. Small moments, Xavier's hand steadying her as she climbed down from the wagon, the lingering glance across the dinner table, the way he listened intently when she spoke, all carried fresh significance. The children noticed too, particularly Emma, who watched them with knowing eyes beyond her years. One afternoon, as Beatrice hung laundry while Xavier repaired a fence nearby, Emma approached her mother. "Do you like Mr. Blackwood, Mama?" she asked directly. Beatrice nearly dropped the sheet she was hanging. "Of course I do. He's been very kind to us." Emma shook her head. "Not like that. Like you like Papa." "Emma, that's not an appropriate question," Beatrice admonished gently, though her cheeks warmed. "I think he likes you," Emma continued, undeterred. "He watches you when you're not looking. And he smiles more now." Before Beatrice could respond, Thomas came running up, excitement animating his features. "Mama, Xavier says I can help brand the calves tomorrow. Real ranching work." The moment passed, but Emma's observations lingered in Beatrice's mind. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she found herself more aware of Xavier's presence in the house, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, the deep timbre of his voice as he spoke with Miguel outside, the way the kitchen seemed smaller when he entered it. "Need any help?" he asked, washing his hands at the basin. "You could slice the bread," she suggested, turning back to the stew bubbling on the stove. They worked side by side, moving around each other with increasing familiarity. When their hands brushed as she passed him a plate, Beatrice felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. "Beatrice," Xavier said suddenly, her name sounding different in his voice. "There's a spring gathering in town next Saturday. Dancing, food, the usual community affairs. Would you and the children like to attend?" The invitation surprised her. "Are you sure that's wise?" Holloway doesn't own the town, despite what he thinks," Xavier interrupted, a rare flash of anger crossing his features. "And it's been nearly 2 months. People should see that you're doing well, that his attempts to isolate you failed." Pride colored his words, and Beatrice realized he wanted to show the townspeople that he had defied Holloway's unofficial decree. But there was something more in his invitation, a step toward acknowledging whatever was growing between them. "We'd be honored to accompany you," she said finally. The day of the gathering brought unexpected nerves. Beatrice spent extra time preparing the children, washing their faces, combing their hair, and ensuring their clothes, though simple, were impeccably clean. For herself, she wore her one good dress, a deep blue cotton that James had always admired. The thought of her husband brought a pang of complicated emotions. The initial shock and grief had gradually given way to anger as she learned more about his deceptions, the gambling debts that had put their family at risk long before his death. Yet he had been her husband, the father of her children, and part of her would always mourn what they had lost. Xavier's appreciative gaze when she emerged from the bedroom helped push those thoughts aside. He had cleaned up as well, trading his work clothes for a pressed shirt and vest. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, flushing slightly at the directness of his compliment. The journey to town was filled with the children's excited chatter. Even little Sarah sensed the specialness of the occasion, pointing out wildflowers and birds along the way. Beatrice found herself sharing their anticipation, though anxiety crept in as the town came into view. The gathering was being held in the cleared area behind the church, where tables had been set up, lanterns hung from ropes strung between posts, and a small group of musicians was preparing to play. Many townspeople were already there, clusters of families and neighbors talking and laughing. A hush fell over the nearest group as Xavier helped Beatrice and the children down from the wagon. She felt their stares, heard the whispers begin, and instinctively reached for Sarah, lifting the child into her arms. Xavier's hand came to rest at the small of her back, a gesture of support and perhaps possession. "Evening, folks," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the space. Sheriff Mason approached first, hat in hand. "Blackwood," he acknowledged, then turned to Beatrice. "Mrs. Wheeler, good to see you and the young ones." The simple greeting seemed to break a spell. Mrs. Finley hurried over, her earlier rejection apparently forgotten, as she exclaimed over how well the children looked. Others followed, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith and his wife, the general store owner, each greeting them with varying degrees of warmth and curiosity. Not everyone was welcoming. Beatrice noticed several men watching from a distance, their expressions hostile. One she recognized as Holloway's foreman from the mine. "Ignore them," Xavier murmured, following her gaze. "Holloway isn't here. He rarely attends these gatherings." The music started, a lively fiddle tune that had couples forming for a dance. Xavier turned to Beatrice, a question in his eyes. "The children," she began. "Will be fine with me," Mrs. Finley interjected, having overheard. "Go on, dear. Enjoy yourself for a moment." Before Beatrice could protest further, Xavier was leading her to the area cleared for dancing. His hand was warm against hers, his other resting lightly at her waist as they joined the other couples. "I haven't danced in years," she admitted as they began to move with the music. "Neither have I," Xavier replied, a rare smile lighting his features. "Might step on your toes." But he didn't. They moved together with surprising grace, finding rhythm in the simple steps. Beatrice was acutely aware of his proximity, the clean scent of soap, the strength in his hand at her waist. For a few precious minutes, the world narrowed to just the two of them, moving in harmony amidst the music and laughter. The spell broke when the music ended. As they stepped apart, Beatrice noticed a commotion at the edge of the gathering. 3 men had arrived well-dressed, with the unmistakable bearing of authority. At their center stood a figure she recognized immediately, Elias Holloway. Xavier's posture stiffened beside her. "Stay with the children," he said quietly. "I'll handle this." But it was too late for avoidance. Holloway had spotted them, his cold gaze fixing on Beatrice before shifting to Xavier. With deliberate steps, he approached, his men flanking him. "Blackwood," he greeted, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education. "I'm surprised to see you here. Usually prefer your solitude, don't you?" "Holloway," Xavier acknowledged with a curt nod. Holloway turned his attention to Beatrice. "Mrs. Wheeler, you're looking well, considering your circumstances." "No thanks to you," she replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. A thin smile crossed Holloway's face. "Your husband made his choices. I merely responded accordingly. By taking our home and turning the town against us." "Business, Mrs. Wheeler. Nothing personal." His gaze swept over her, then back to Xavier. "Though I see you found alternative arrangements rather quickly." The implication in his tone made Beatrice's cheeks burn with anger. Before she could respond, Xavier stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her. "You've said your piece, Holloway. Move along." The mine owner's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Blackwood. You may own your land, but I own this town. Crossing me has consequences." "Is that a threat?" Xavier's voice remained calm, but Beatrice sensed the tension coiling within him. "Merely an observation." Holloway adjusted his jacket. "Enjoy the festivities. I understand the widow Wheeler makes excellent apple pie. Perhaps she'll serve you a slice." Among other comforts. Xavier's movement was so swift that Beatrice barely registered it. One moment he was beside her. The next he had Holloway by the collar, the mine owner's feet barely touching the ground. "Apologize to the lady," Xavier demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Holloway's men reached for their weapons, but Sheriff Mason appeared, his own gun drawn. "That's enough," he ordered. "Put him down, Blackwood." For a moment, Beatrice feared Xavier wouldn't comply. Then, slowly, he released Holloway, who staggered back, straightening his rumpled clothing with trembling hands. "You'll regret that," Holloway hissed. "I doubt it," Xavier replied evenly. The sheriff stepped between them. "Mr. Holloway, I think it's best if you and your men leave. This is a peaceful gathering." Holloway's face flushed with humiliation, but he offered no further resistance. With a final venomous glance at Xavier and Beatrice, he turned and stalked away, his men following. The gathered townspeople, who had watched the confrontation with bated breath, erupted into murmurs. Beatrice felt their eyes on her and Xavier, speculation running rampant. "We should go," she said quietly, already scanning the crowd for her children. Xavier nodded, his expression grim. "I'm sorry. Shouldn't have lost my temper." "You were defending my honor," Beatrice replied, touching his arm briefly. "Thank you." They collected the children, who thankfully had been kept occupied by Mrs. Finley and hadn't witnessed the altercation. As they prepared to leave, several townspeople approached, offering words of support and, surprisingly, apologies for their earlier treatment of Beatrice and her children. "Seems Holloway's grip is slipping," Xavier observed as they drove home under the star-filled sky. "Because you stood up to him," Beatrice said. "No one else has dared." Xavier glanced at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. "Worth it." The children had fallen asleep in the back of the wagon, the excitement of the evening having worn them out. In the quiet that followed, Beatrice found herself reflecting on how much had changed in the 2 months since Xavier had offered them shelter. From desperate fear to growing security, from grief to something new, something hopeful. "What he implied," she said suddenly, needing to address the undercurrent of Holloway's insinuation. About us. Xavier kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Man's a snake. Pay him no mind. But people will talk. They'll assume, let them. Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. Unless. Does it bother you? What they might think. The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Beatrice chose her words carefully. What bothers me is that they might be right about my feelings, but wrong about my actions. Xavier glanced at her sharply. Your feelings? Heat crept into her cheeks, but Beatrice didn't look away. I'm a widow with 3 children, dependent on your charity, never charity, he interrupted. Your employment, then. It would be inappropriate for me to harbor certain feelings. And yet I find myself doing so nonetheless. The wagon slowed as Xavier processed her words. Beatrice, he said finally, her name a caress in his voice. Nothing about what I feel for you and those children is inappropriate. But I won't rush you. You've had enough upheaval. His honesty touched her deeply. Thank you for understanding. They completed the journey in companionable silence, the air between them charged with new awareness. When they arrived at the ranch, Xavier carried the sleeping Thomas while Beatrice managed the girls. They worked together seamlessly, settling the children without waking them. On the porch afterward, Xavier paused before bidding her good night. Whatever happens with Holloway, with the town, you have a home here. All of you. I want you to know that. I believe you, Beatrice replied softly. Good night, Xavier. Good night, Beatrice. The incident at the gathering marked a turning point, both in their relationship and in their standing with the town. Over the following weeks, several townspeople made the journey to Xavier's ranch, ostensibly to trade or conduct business, but clearly also to demonstrate their independence from Holloway's influence. Mrs. Finley brought fabric for new clothes for the children. The schoolteacher offered to tutor Emma and Thomas once a week. The blacksmith came to shoe Xavier's horses and stayed for dinner. Each small gesture helped heal the wounds of rejection Beatrice had suffered. More significantly, the walls between her and Xavier continued to lower. They spoke more openly in the evenings after the children were asleep, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Beatrice learned of his childhood in Ohio, his journey west after the war, the love he'd found and lost with his wife, Catherine. In turn, she told him about growing up the daughter of a shopkeeper, meeting James when he passed through her town, the whirlwind romance that had swept her away from everything familiar. She spoke honestly of the good times and the bad, James's charm and affection, but also his restlessness, his gambling, his inability to be satisfied with what they had. I loved him, she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch. But I was often lonely, even with him beside me. Xavier considered this. Marriage should be a partnership, he said finally. At least, that's what I believed with Catherine. We faced everything together. That's what I wanted, Beatrice sighed. James saw me as an accessory to his life, I think. Something to show off when it suited him, to ignore when it didn't. He was a fool, then, Xavier said simply. Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Beatrice felt the now familiar warmth spreading through her chest. 3 months of mourning seemed both an eternity and an instant. Part of her would always grieve what might have been with James, but increasingly, her thoughts turned toward what could be with Xavier. The children had already formed their attachments. Thomas followed Xavier like a shadow, absorbing every lesson about cattle and horses, beaming with pride when given responsibilities around the ranch. Emma had appointed herself assistant housekeeper, helping Beatrice with cooking and cleaning while also developing a special friendship with Miguel, who taught her Spanish words and told her stories of Mexico. Even little Sarah had found her place, trailing after the older children or sitting contentedly on the porch with the ranch cat in her lap. They had become a family in all but name, Beatrice realized. The thought was simultaneously frightening and exhilarating. The summer heat gave way to autumn's cooler temperatures, bringing with it the busy season of cattle sales. Xavier spent long days moving herds, often returning after dark, exhausted but satisfied with the profits that would sustain them through winter. One such evening, as Beatrice set a plate of food before him, their hands touched. Instead of the brief contact they usually allowed themselves, Xavier's fingers closed gently around hers. I need to speak with you, he said quietly, mindful of the children playing in the next room. Beatrice's heart quickened. Of course. Not now? After the children are asleep, the hours until then stretched endlessly. Beatrice moved through the evening routine with outward calm, helping the children wash up, listening to their prayers, tucking them into bed. Inside, her thoughts raced with possibilities of what Xavier wished to discuss. When she finally joined him on the porch, the night air had turned crisp, stars brilliantly clear in the vast Wyoming sky. Xavier had poured 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to her as she took her usual seat. "You're making me nervous," she admitted, accepting the rare indulgence. A smile ghosted across his features. "Not my intention." He took a breath, as if gathering courage. "I've been thinking about the future. About all of us." "So have I," Beatrice said softly. "These past months with you and the children here. They've been the happiest I've known since losing Catherine and our boy." Xavier looked at her directly. "I never expected to find a family again." "We never expected to need one," Beatrice replied. "But fate had other plans." Xavier nodded, setting his glass aside. "Beatrice, I'm not a man of fancy words. But I know what I want, what I believe we both want." He reached for her hand. "I want to make this official. I want to marry you, to adopt the children legally, to build a life together not as employer and employee, but as husband and wife." Though she had suspected this might be coming, the directness of his proposal still took her breath away. "Xavier, I know it's been less than 4 months since James died," he continued quickly. "If you need more time, I understand. But I wanted you to know my intentions are honorable. You and those children belong here with me, not as charity cases or workers, but as my family." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes. "The children would be overjoyed," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Especially Thomas. He already looks to you as a father." "And you?" Xavier asked, his usually confident voice tinged with uncertainty. "Would you be content as my wife? This isn't the life you planned." Beatrice squeezed his hand. "No, it isn't. It's better." She took a steadying breath. "I would be honored to marry you, Xavier. I've grown to love you in these months together. Your kindness, your strength, your integrity, they're everything I've ever wanted in a partner." The relief and joy that transformed his features made him look younger, the habitual sternness melting away. "I love you too, Beatrice. Have almost from the beginning, I think." He leaned forward then, slowly enough that she could have pulled away. Instead, Beatrice met him halfway, their lips coming together in a first kiss that held both gentleness and promise. His hand came up to cradle her cheek, calloused fingers impossibly tender against her skin. When they parted, Beatrice felt breathless, alive in a way she hadn't in years, perhaps ever. "When?" she asked simply. "Soon, if you're willing. Before winter sets in." Xavier smiled. "I'd ride to town tomorrow for the license, but Holloway," Beatrice finished, reality intruding on their moment. Xavier's expression hardened slightly. "He can't stop us, but he might try to make trouble." "Let him try," Beatrice said with newfound determination. "We've faced worse." The next morning, they gathered the children at breakfast to share their news. Emma's shriek of delight brought Miguel running from the barn, worried something was wrong. Thomas bombarded Xavier with questions about whether this meant he could officially learn to be a rancher now. Sarah, though too young to fully understand, caught the excitement of her siblings and clapped her hands happily. "So we'll really belong here forever?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. Xavier knelt before her. "You already belong here," he said firmly. "The wedding just makes it official in the eyes of the law and God." Miguel offered enthusiastic congratulations, pumping Xavier's hand and kissing Beatrice on both cheeks in the Mexican tradition. "It is about time," he declared with a knowing grin. "The way you two look at each other when you think no one sees AI, it would make the poets weep." Beatrice blushed while Xavier cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll ride to town today for the license," he announced, changing the subject, "and to speak with the minister about performing the ceremony here at the ranch." "I'll go with you," Beatrice decided. "The children can stay with Miguel." Xavier looked concerned. "Are you sure?" "Holloway is a problem we face together," she interrupted firmly. "Besides, I need to order fabric for a wedding dress." His smile was worth any risk. Together, then. The journey to town was different this time, filled with plans and hopes rather than fear and uncertainty. They discussed expanding the house to give the children more room, possibly hiring another ranch hand now that the cattle business was growing, and 100 other details of the shared future stretching before them. Juniper Creek appeared much as it always had, dusty and quiet in the mid-morning sun. A few people nodded greetings as Xavier helped Beatrice down from the wagon, their attitudes noticeably warmer than during previous visits. Their first stop was the minister's house beside the church. Reverend Porter welcomed them warmly, expressing genuine pleasure at their news. "I'd be honored to perform the ceremony," he said, offering them tea in his modest parlor. "And might I say, it does my heart good to see happiness growing from such difficult circumstances." "Thank you, Reverend," Beatrice replied. "We were hoping you could come to the ranch. It would be easier with the children, and—" She hesitated, not wanting to mention Holloway directly. "And more private," Xavier finished diplomatically. "Just family and a few friends." The minister nodded understanding. "Of course. When were you thinking?" 2 weeks from Saturday, Xavier suggested, looking to Beatrice for confirmation. She nodded, warmth spreading through her at his consideration. With the minister's agreement secured, they continued to the county clerk's office for the marriage license, then to the general store where Beatrice selected fabric for her wedding dress, a warm cream-colored wool that would be practical for the approaching winter, yet special enough for the occasion. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, a familiar and unwelcome voice called out, Well, if it isn't the grieving widow and her protector." Holloway stood across the street, flanked as always by his men. He crossed toward them, his expensive boots raising little puffs of dust with each deliberate step. Xavier's hand went instinctively to Beatrice's back. "Holloway," he acknowledged coldly. "I couldn't help overhearing at the clerk's office," Holloway continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A marriage license? My, Mrs. Wheeler, you waste no time securing your position." Beatrice lifted her chin. "My husband has been dead for 4 months, Mr. Holloway, and my personal life is no concern of yours." "Perhaps not," Holloway conceded with false graciousness. "Though I wonder what your children think of their mothers." Adaptability. Xavier stepped forward, but Beatrice placed a restraining hand on his arm. "My children are thriving with Mr. Blackwood," she said evenly. "He has shown them more kindness in 4 months than you have shown this entire town in years." Holloway's facade cracked slightly, genuine anger flashing in his eyes. "Careful, Mrs. Wheeler. Your new fiancé may own his land, but your late husband's debts to me remain unpaid. I could make legal claims against any property you might acquire through marriage." "You already took our home," Beatrice replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What more could you want? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything." Holloway's gaze shifted to Xavier. "Depends on how reasonable your future husband proves to be about certain business opportunities I've been considering. Water rights from that creek running through his property would be most valuable to my mining operations." Xavier's expression hardened. "My water rights aren't for sale, and any debts James Wheeler owed died with him." "The law might see things differently," Holloway said smoothly, "especially when interpreted by judges who understand the importance of progress and development in our territory." Before Xavier could respond, Sheriff Mason approached, his presence a welcome interruption. "Everything all right here?" he asked, though his wary glance between the parties made it clear he suspected otherwise. "Perfectly fine, Sheriff," Holloway replied, "just congratulating the happy couple on their engagement." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness. "Good day to you both. I'm sure we'll speak again soon." As he walked away, Beatrice released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He won't stop, will he?" "Not willingly," Xavier agreed grimly. "But neither will we." He turned to the sheriff. "Mason, is there any legal merit to his claims about James's debts transferring to Beatrice after our marriage?" The sheriff scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Territory laws complicated on such matters. Might be wise to consult with Judge Wilson next time he's in town. He's no friend of Holloway's." "When will that be?" Beatrice asked. "Circuit takes him through here in about 3 weeks." Xavier and Beatrice exchanged glances. Their planned wedding date was sooner than that. "We should wait," Beatrice said reluctantly. "Make sure everything is legally sound before we proceed." Xavier nodded, though disappointment flashed in his eyes. Better to be cautious. He turned back to the sheriff. "Send word when the judge arrives? We'll ride in to speak with him." "Will do," Mason promised. "And for what it's worth, congratulations. Town's been waiting for you two to make it official." Despite Holloway's threats casting a shadow over their plans, Beatrice found herself smiling at the sheriff's words. Thank you. The return journey was quieter, both of them processing the encounter with Holloway and its implications. As the ranch came into view, however, Beatrice felt a renewed sense of determination. He won't take this from us, she said firmly. Xavier reached for her hand. No, he won't. If we have to wait for the judge, we wait. If we have to fight Holloway in court, we fight. But in the end, we'll be together properly, legally, with nothing he can use against us. The children will be disappointed about the delay. We'll explain. They're resilient, and they know we're committed to them. Xavier's grip on her hand tightened. This is just a temporary setback. The children were indeed disappointed when told the wedding would be postponed, but they accepted the explanation with the same resilience Xavier had predicted. Life at the ranch continued, cattle to tend, repairs to make, preparations for winter to complete. Xavier began expanding the house as planned, adding 2 more bedrooms so each child could have their own space. Beatrice worked on her wedding dress in the evenings, stitching by lamplight after the children were asleep. The anticipation of their future together made the delay more bearable. 3 weeks later, word came that Judge Wilson had arrived in Juniper Creek. Xavier and Beatrice rode to town immediately, leaving the children with Miguel. The judge, a serious man with spectacles and a reputation for fairness, listened attentively to their situation. Holloway's claim is tenuous at best, he concluded after they'd explained everything. A debt can transfer to a spouse who was married at the time it was incurred, but not to a future spouse who had no connection to the original borrower. Relief washed over Beatrice. So he can't make any legal claim against Xavier's property after we marry? Not on those grounds, no. The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. However, I would advise having your marriage contract specifically state that all property owned by Mr. Blackwood prior to the marriage remains solely in his name. It's an additional safeguard. We can do that, Xavier agreed readily. As for Holloway's interest in your water rights, the judge continued, that's a separate matter. He cannot force you to sell, but he might make things difficult in other ways. The man has considerable influence. We're aware, Beatrice said dryly. The judge smiled slightly. I imagine you are. Well, with the legal precautions I've outlined, you should be protected from his most obvious avenues of attack. I'd be happy to draw up the necessary documents before I leave town tomorrow. Thank you, Your Honor, Xavier said, standing to shake the man's hand. We'd appreciate that greatly. With the judge's assurance, they set their wedding date for the following Saturday. Reverend Porter agreed to the new date, and Beatrice threw herself into final preparations with renewed energy. The house addition was nearly complete, her dress finished, and Miguel had promised to prepare a feast incorporating traditional Mexican dishes alongside American favorites. On the morning of the wedding, Beatrice woke to find Emma sitting on the edge of her bed, holding a small bouquet of late wildflowers and sprigs of evergreen. I picked these for you, her daughter said shyly. Miguel helped me arrange them. Tears sprang to Beatrice's eyes as she accepted the simple but beautiful offering. They're perfect, sweetheart. Are you happy, Mama? Emma asked, her young face serious. Truly happy. Beatrice drew her daughter into an embrace. Happier than I've been in a very long time. Xavier is a good man, and he loves us all so much. I know, Emma said with the certainty of a child who feels secure. He told me he asked my permission before asking you to marry him. This was news to Beatrice. Did he? Emma nodded solemnly. He said that since I'm the oldest, he wanted to make sure I approved. I told him yes, because he makes you smile again. Fresh tears threatened. You are very wise for your age, Emma Wheeler. Emma Blackwood soon, her daughter corrected with a grin. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. They gathered in the newly expanded main room of the house, which had been decorated with pine boughs and ribbon. Miguel stood as Xavier's witness, while Mrs. Finley, who had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, stood for Beatrice. The children positioned themselves prominently beside their mother. Thomas proudly, wearing a new shirt Xavier had ordered from the general store, the girls with ribbons in their hair. Reverend Porter spoke eloquently about new beginnings and families formed by choice as well as blood. When the time came for vows, Xavier took Beatrice's hands in his usually steady voice thick with emotion. Beatrice, When you and your children came into my life, you brought light back to a place that had known only shadows. I promise to cherish that light, to protect it with everything I have, to be the husband you deserve and the father these children need. Where you belong, I belong. Together. Beatrice blinked back tears as she responded. Xavier, you offered shelter when we had nowhere to turn, but you gave us so much more dignity, purpose, hope. I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges we face, to build our home and family with love and honesty, to remember always that with you is where we truly belong. The exchange of simple gold bands, the pronouncement of their marriage, the first kiss as husband and wife, each moment etched itself indelibly in Beatrice's memory. But perhaps the most precious was the sight of her children's faces, alight with joy and security, as Xavier knelt to embrace each of them after the ceremony. We're officially a family now, he told them. Though in all the ways that truly matter, we have been for months. The celebration that followed was joyous. Miguel's feast devoured with appreciation, music from a fiddle played by one of the neighboring ranchers, dancing and laughter filling the house until late in the evening. When the last guest had departed and the children were finally asleep, Xavier led his new wife onto the porch, where they had shared so many important conversations. Happy, Mrs. Blackwood? He asked, drawing her into his arms. Completely, she replied, resting her head against his chest. Though I keep expecting Holloway to appear and ruin everything. Xavier chuckled, the sound rumbling beneath her ear. Not tonight. Tonight is ours. And it was the first of many nights, weeks, months, and years that would follow. Their life together wasn't without challenges. Holloway continued his attempts to acquire Xavier's water rights, even trying at one point to divert the creek before legal action stopped him. But with each challenge, the Blackwood family grew stronger, more tightly knit, more certain of their place together. The ranch prospered under Xavier and Beatrice's joint management. Thomas, as he grew into adolescence, showed a natural talent for breeding cattle, eventually helping to develop a strain particularly well-suited to Wyoming's harsh conditions. Emma's academic abilities flourished under the tutelage of the town's schoolteacher, leading eventually to her becoming a teacher herself. Little Sarah, no longer quite so little, revealed an unexpected gift for healing, apprenticing with the local doctor when she was old enough. 5 years after their wedding, Beatrice gave birth to twins, a boy they named William and a girl they called Catherine, honoring Xavier's first wife. The older children embraced their half-siblings with enthusiasm, Thomas particularly proud to teach his little brother about ranch life, as Xavier had once taught him. As the years passed, Juniper Creek changed too. Holloway's influence waned as new settlers arrived, bringing different priorities and perspectives. When the railroad finally reached the area in 1885, the town expanded rapidly, and Xavier's cattle operation grew with it, providing the family with comfort and security. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Beatrice with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since marrying. As they stood on the deck of a ferry crossing the bay, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier wrapped his arms around her from behind. Any regrets? He asked quietly. Beatrice leaned back against him, secure in the embrace that had become her home. Not one, she replied truthfully. Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led us to each other. How could I regret that? Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. I thank God every day for bringing you to my door, even with 5 children underfoot and all the chaos that entails. Beatrice teased. Especially then, he affirmed. Before you, I had a house. You made it a home. As the sun slipped below the horizon, Beatrice turned in her husband's arms to kiss him properly, remembering the desperate woman she had been, the children who had been turned away by everyone, and the life-changing moment when a quiet cowboy had said 7 simple words that had altered their destiny. You belong here with me. And they did, now and always.